I was on my third cup of coffee when I first noticed something strange. A fleeting glimpse of a figure reflected in my laptop screen as I worked at my dining room table. Dismissing it as a trick of the light, a symptom of my sleepless nights, I kept typing, the rhythm of the keys a comforting, steady background noise. But the unease lingered. My house, an old pre-war structure in a quiet New England suburb, had always been my haven. Its weathered wooden floors creaked familiarly underfoot, the sloping ceilings in the bedrooms somehow cozy rather than confining. I had moved here to escape the frenzy of city life, to find peace in the slow cadence of small-town living. But as the days grew shorter and the shadows stretched ever longer, peace felt elusive. It started with small occurrences, sounds that seemed out of place for a house settling into autumn. The faint scuffle of what I assumed were squirrels in the attic and the distant shiver of wind through the older window frames were normal. Yet often in the silent pre-dawn hours, I would be woken by something else. A low thud, like a door closing softly or the heavy tread of footsteps on the ground floor. Roused from sleep by these sounds, I would lie in bed, heart thudding in my ears, breath held hostage, waiting for whatever came next. Nothing ever did. But each morning, the anxiety chipped a little more at my resolve, and I felt myself becoming not quite myself. My friends were the first to notice. They would make comments about the circles etching themselves beneath my eyes, ask about my nerves, jokingly at first, and then with more pointed concern, trying to pull me back to the sunny, pragmatic person I used to be. One crisp October evening, planning to distract myself with mundane tasks, I decided to clean out the basement, a dark, low-ceilinged room that I'd largely ignored since moving in. It was filled with the previous owner's possessions, now covered in a fine layer of dust. Boxes were stacked in precarious towers, labeled Christmas decorations, old-school books, kitchen misc. It struck me like a little voyeuristic adventure into someone else's past. Halfway through moving the boxes, turning the items over in search of anything I might find useful or intriguing, my hand brushed against something smooth and cool that definitely did not belong. At first, I thought it was a book, its binding oddly dense, but as I dragged it into the light, the texture under my fingers made me recoil. It was an old cassette tape, its label yellowed with age, the writing smudged yet vaguely legible in the dim light. Interviews 1973. I don't own a cassette player and hadn't seen one in years. But, driven by some unshakable compulsion, I couldn't just leave it. A sense of anticipation mingled with unease as I fitted it into an old Walkman I found in the bottom of one of the boxes, praying it still had a charge. The first few seconds of the tape crackled with nonsensical static. Then a voice, softened by time and muffled by poor equipment quality, emerged. The person was recounting their dreams in disjointed fragments, punctuated by long pauses. Dreams of an unending maze of rooms and halls, all eerily similar, devoid of sound, yet full of the creeping terror of being watched. The voice shifted, becoming first more manic, then fraying to a whisper. A string of disconnected imagery slurred together, doors slamming, footsteps echoing in empty corridors, whispers growing louder, closer. I sat frozen, entranced by the audio relic, unable to shake the paralyzing sensation that the faceless person was describing what I'd been feeling every night in my own home. For the next 2 weeks, I was gripped by an irrational fear. During the day, a pervasive anxiety wrapped itself around my routine, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. At night, I felt an unseen presence, stirring the air around me, heavier and dense with expectation. I tried everything, sleeping with the radio on, lights blazing, in every room, even scattering salt along thresholds in a feeble attempt to bar entry to whatever or whoever it was. Nothing helped. It was a wet, cold Wednesday when my rest fractured completely. Driven by some primal instinct, I found myself standing in the middle of my living room, listening intently. It was not quite dawn, the hour when the world is caught between the end of night and the beginning of day. But the silence was different, complete and oppressive, as if drawing in a breath and holding it. I turned slowly, scanning for anything out of place, when my eye caught a subtle movement near the back door. There, almost imperceptible, was a figure, distorted through the frosted glass. My heart leapt painfully against my ribs and I strained to see, but there was nothing closer to clarity than a looming shape framed by the backyard's tall, skeletal trees swaying slowly in the early morning breeze. I stumbled backward, bumping into a side table and sending a lamp crashing to the floor in a burst of sound that startled me almost into laughter. When I looked back, the figure had vanished, if it had ever been there to begin with. Yet each breath felt heavy, wedged in my throat, echoing in the forgotten corners of the memory I unearthed with that cursed tape. In the clarity that follows adrenaline, I made an impulsive decision to break the cycle. I packed a small bag, brewed a final pot of coffee, and scrawled a note to myself that felt oddly necessary, as if afraid I might forget my own resolve. The sun was rising as I left, and the air held a rare vibrancy, infused with the smell of wet earth and fallen leaves. I checked into the nearest hotel, a place that advertised a hot breakfast and a deserted indoor pool. I carried the Walkman with its worn tape like a talisman, though I couldn't bring myself to listen again. I spent hours researching the house, digging into public records and old newspapers for any mention of suspicious activity. Nothing stood out, no unsolved mysteries or tragic tales, yet something whispered insistently at the edges of my mind. It was an unseasonably warm afternoon when I drove back to the house, parking cautiously behind the tall fence that bordered the backyard. The sky was overcast, the clouds weighed down with unshed rain, casting a pallid light over everything. I crept through the garden, each footstep muted by the thick grass and fallen twigs. My plan was unclear: to confirm, to confront, to rationalize away the uneasy churn of emotions that had settled so deeply. The back door yielded easily under my touch. Inside, the air was cold and stale, the house dark and expectant, as if holding its breath. I hesitated before uncovering the downstairs windows, allowing the dull light to filter in and paint the walls in broad strokes of gray. Each room stood just as I had left it: abandoned teacup on the kitchen counter, books askance on the living room shelves. It was upon turning back toward the front of the house that I noticed the door, the one that I hadn't closed myself, moving at the whims of the drafts that roamed these old walls. I could see tiny details, scratches softened by years of paint, the indentations where handles had been replaced. I drew an unsteady breath, stepping towards it. There was a mirror in the front hall, its reflection capturing my exhausted, gaunt features distorted, an image of a person who had ventured too far from their own reality. And there, behind me, materializing in the periphery, was that shape again, a figure discernible in the wavering pattern of light on glass, gone in an instant when I turned to confront it. I was rooted to the spot when a sudden knock on the door startled me from my trance, a sharp staccato sound slicing through the thick tension. I bit back a gasp, each thud a physical blow to my frayed nerves. I wanted nothing more than to run, to crawl into the security of the world outside these whispering walls. Yet somehow, I opened the door. Stand. There was a neighbor from down the road, a kindly older woman who I had spoken to occasionally. She regarded me with concerned eyes, her demeanor one of gentle inquiry and unwelcome intrusion. She had seen the hotel parking receipt on my dash, she explained, and wanted to ensure everything was all right. Did I require assistance? Had something happened? There was something comforting in the exchange, something grounding. In a faltering voice, I recounted the tape, the footsteps, the shadows at the edges of my vision. Her expression shifted subtly, part understanding, part amusement, indulgent conspiracy between neighbors with nothing but the thinnest of walls separating their lives. Old houses, she said softly, her eyes drawn to the aging structure that lurked behind me. They carry more than dust in their bones. The words echoed like a bell through the shallows of my resolve. And though she left shortly after, her small frame slowly fading into the fall-encased landscape, I felt a weight lift ever so slightly, a feeling of not entirely being alone, despite the presence that clearly enveloped this space. I followed a new kind of calm inside. I had made my peace with the restless spirits of mere history, but could not ignore that the air still thrummed with anticipation, the walls too heavy with the past. Against the backdrop of encroaching night, a night that would fall as inevitable as the dawn, I found instead a tentative resilience. The house would start its nocturnal vigil soon, and I knew, in its way, it was waiting to see if I'd found what I was looking for. As I settled into a familiar chair, finally facing the unknown within its unfathomable depths, I cast a final glance towards the unlikely harbinger, a small, dusty tape that had brought me, stubbornly shuffling, closer to the fragile edges of its long-lost touched reality.